I'm working on a restoration of this vintage press that I recently found. This is a Dake UT10C. What I've done so far is take everything apart, strip all the paint off, repaint it, clean it up, and now it's time to put it back together. This is like an H-frame press that you may have seen, but this one is not hydraulic. This is a screw press. It's all manual, and it's a very simple, elegant design. This entire press has only 26 parts, and that's if you count the ball knobs separately from the things they're attached to. This is the original hardware, and it's square heads on the bolts and nuts, which are quite a bit more common on vintage equipment. This hardware isn't in particularly great shape. I decided to replace it, but then I agonized a little bit about what to replace it with. I ended up deciding that this old classic press deserves square nuts and bolts again. So I was able to find 3/8-16 bolts with square heads and the corresponding nuts. Unfortunately, the only nuts I could find were zinc in color, and the only bolts I could find were yellow and gold in color. So they don't match, and for the moment I'm just going to have to live with that. All of the bolts and nuts on this press are recessed down in this steel channel where there isn't room for a wrench to rotate. So what we need really is a socket. But this is where square-headed bolts and nuts get rather awkward because they don't fit in a 6-point socket. This is the right size socket, it's 9/16, but the square head just won't fit. And just for the record, a 12-point socket doesn't really work either. So to work with square-headed nuts and bolts, what you really need is an 8-point socket, which is rather rare, but I was able to find an 8-point socket set. So the first thing I'm going to do is assemble what's actually called the table. And it's really quite simple. It's just these 2 pieces of steel screwed together with some separators. So the table mounts in the frame simply with these pins going through the other set of holes. And there are holes all up and down the frame so that you can adjust the height. Dake made this press in 3 different sizes, A, B, and C. This is the UT10C, which is the largest of the 3. Really too large to be sitting on a bench like I have it now. I'll end up putting it on the floor or on a shorter stand of some kind. The UT10A is a bench-mounted press because it's much shorter, but the width and capabilities are the same. Everything else about the 3 presses is identical. It's simply the height. There's a gentleman on OWWM.org who has all 3 of them. It makes for a lovely family photo. This is actually the standard table, but originally Dake offered an accessory, an option, called the open front table. And this was designed to make it easier to press motor bearings, mostly. I haven't actually stripped and refinished this piece yet, so you can sort of see a little bit of a before and after. This is what the entire thing looked like before I started. I guess it was a little unorthodox changing the color so drastically, but I am rather fond of this forest green, so I'm going to stick with it. So the other 2 bolts are simply used to mount this head casting in the top of the frame through these holes here. I'm zooming in here so you can see that the nut casting on my press is actually damaged. Somebody abused this press and tried to exert more pressure than it was supposed to give, or they forgot to lubricate it properly, but a couple of the rows of threads here at the bottom of the nut casting are broken off. This is only a 10-ton press, and I dare say with the damage that mine has, I will think of it as more like a 5-ton press. The rest of the assembly is simply to thread this screw down through the top of the nut, and on the other side we'll attach a collar the thrust bearing and the nose. And then of course this handle goes through that hole, which is used for leverage to turn the screw. Of course, we have to decide what to use to lubricate the screw. One of the people on OWWM.org that seemed to know something about this said that the closest modern equivalent to the compounded whey oil that Dake recommended decades ago would be 90-weight extreme pressure machine oil. And it turned out that I actually have some of that, which I use to lubricate the gearbox on my garden tiller. So I'm gonna just give it a try. So with the screw partially threaded through the nut here, it's time to attach the hardware to the bottom. The way this thing goes together is that the collar goes on first, and then the bearing, and then the nose is gonna go on like that with the bearings sandwiched in between the two. This recess up here is actually where the set screw for the nose goes in. The set screw is not tightened against anything. It's simply there to prevent the nose from falling off, and that's what holds the bearing in place. The original design of this press came from Atlas, and when Dake acquired Atlas in 1944, they made a few improvements or changes to the design and continued to sell it for decades thereafter. I believe this press appears in the 1990 Dake catalog, but by a few years later it had disappeared, so I assume that was around the time frame that it was discontinued. I don't have much way of narrowing down when my particular press was made. Anywhere between 1944 and 1990-ish would be a reasonable guess, but it could have been after, because they did apparently continue to make these on request until they ran out of the nut castings.